Hello everyone, I am the Meta Kirby, and welcome to my channel, The Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. The Brewery is a series on this channel showcasing my spicy brews and other deck techs. On this episode of the Brewery, I'll be discussing my take on a commander from the March of the Machine, Ayara, Widow of the Realm. If you like this deck or any of the cards I'll be mentioning throughout the video, please consider using my CCG player affiliate link when purchasing those cards. You can find that link down in the description. It'll really help out the channel. But the very best way you can help support the channel is with my Patreon. There are plenty of perks for being a patron, such as early access to certain videos, exclusive deck techs, gifts, and more. You can also support my channel for free by simply liking, subscribing, and sharing, which also helps out a lot. I put out a video every Monday, so you don't want to miss out. You can join my Discord server for free if you want to join the Commander Tavern community. All pertinent links are down in the description. Alright, let's get back to the episode. Ayara is a 3/3 elf noble for 1 generic and 2 black. Since she has an activated ability with red Phyrexian mana, she has a black-red color identity. In this particular case, I built a deck focused primarily on her front side. That's not to say that her transform side is bad. If you pay 5 generic and 1 red Phyrexian, you can transform her at sorcery speed. Her backside reanimates a creature or artifact at the beginning of your combat step. It gains haste and is then exiled at the beginning of the next end step. While this could provide a lot of value in terms of reanimation, it's her front faces ability that I abuse with this deck. For just tapping her and sacrificing a creature or artifact, she deals X damage to target opponent or battle, gaining you X life in the process, where X is the sacrifice permanent's casting cost. Oh, and an instant speed to boot. With Ayara, it's yeet or be yeeted. Since this ability is so strong, I hardly ever transform her, and have focused more on her front side. Since X depends on the permanent's casting cost, we're not going to invest a ton of mana into an expensive card only to sacrifice it for damage. We're going to want to cheat them into play either via reanimation, cheating them from our hand, etc. Or we can reduce their cost so that if we did have to hardcast them, it wouldn't be for so much mana. But before we see those effects in the deck, let's first see what missiles Ayara is going to be flinging at our opponents. Chandra's Incinerator has a built-in way of reducing its generic cost, potentially only costing 1 red mana to cast. Since Ayara's ability is already a non-combat source of damage, we can cast this for 1 red right after activating her. Then we can either keep it around as a 6/6 beater with trample, or it's another potential missile for Ayara to fling. However, if we do keep it around, it functions almost as an Ayara doubler, since it triggers off of her ability dealing damage to an opponent. When she does, Chandra's Incinerator deals that much damage to target creature or planeswalker an opponent controls, so it also functions as interaction. Do not sleep on this card in this deck. Avatar of Woe and Writhing Necromass also have built-in cost reduction effects. They both have the potential of their 6 generic costs being ignored. It's also very easy to do so since we're going to have tons of creatures in our graveyard with this deck. However, while the Zombie Giant only cares about the creatures in our own graveyard, the Avatar counts all creatures in all graveyards, so it's even easier to cast. If we keep the Necromass, it's a 5/5 with Death Touch, which is a great blocker. However, we can always just fling with Ayara to deal 7 damage to someone's face. The Avatar is even more useful since it can tap down to bury any creature, providing amazing removal. It's also a decent beater on its own, potentially getting its 6 power through since it has Fear. However, if it came down to it, sacrificing it to Ayara is 8 damage to someone's face, which is nothing to scoff at. Emrakul the Promised End also has a cost reduction effect depending on what we have in our graveyard. Since the deck has cards from all 9 card types, Emrakul has the potential of only costing 4 mana to cast, which is quite busted. Casting a 13/13 flyer with trample and protection from instants for a measly 4 generic is morale breaking. If that weren't enough, since we're casting it, we get its cast triggered. But even then, even if we don't cast it, we can reanimate it since it doesn't have an effect that shuffles it if it hits the graveyard. In any case, we either have a 13/13 beater or a way to deal 13 damage to someone's face. So if we can swing in with Emrakul, we just fling her with Ayara. Metalwork Colossus and Molten Monstrosity also have cost reducing effects, but this time from what we control on the battlefield. Since the deck is going to want high costed artifacts anyways, the Colossus will almost always either be free or incredibly cheap to cast. If that weren't enough, it also has a built-in reanimation effect allowing us to get it back by sacrificing 2 artifacts. Molten Monstrosity costs X less to cast, where X is the greatest power amongst creatures we control. Since we're almost always having a huge beater on board, this will almost always cost either just 1 red or as low as possible. While a 5/5 with trample is decent enough, it's here mostly to fling at opponents with Ayara. Same with the Colossus since it doesn't have any form of evasion. Ancient Stone Idol can also be entirely free thanks to its cost reduction effect. If anyone were to attack with 10 creatures, we can cast this for free at instant speed, no less. Seeing someone swing in with 10 creatures is not uncommon in Commander games, especially with token decks. And even then, if we did have to pay something for it, it's going to be very cheap. And then we have a 12/12 Trampler to smash face with. Then, if the situation calls for Ayara to fling it at someone, we deal 10 damage to their face and get a 6/12 token with trample for our troubles. This having a death trigger is a huge bonus with this deck, which we'll see soon. Shadow of Mortality is the deck's second most expensive spell to cast. Fortunately, it has a built-in cost reduction effect. Unfortunately, that effect requires us to have at most 27 life to cost only 2 black to cast. Why is this unfortunate? Because Ayara's ability gains us life. But that's fine because we can always just discard it and reanimate it to get into the battlefield. It's still worth running though, since it has a mana value of whopping 15 mana. Mycosynth Golem, Mirror Enforcer, Slag Strider, and Sojourner's Companion have better cost reduction effects though, since they all have affinity for artifacts. The deck has a ton of ways to make this affinity as high as possible, especially since Mycosynth Golem itself has the added bonus of giving affinity for artifacts to all of our artifact creature spells. This makes it even easier to cast our other expensive artifact creatures. However, it does have a mana value of 11, so we can fling it at an opponent if it came down to it. The other 3 are 100% included as sacrifice fodder to Ayara, so don't feel bad about immediately flinging them at someone. Mycosynth Golem can stick around though. Darksteel Citadel, Drostforge Bridge, Vault of the Whispers, Great Furnace, Power Depot, and Treasure Vault are all the artifact lands this deck can run due to its color identity. It is risky to run artifact lands given how common mass artifact hate is in the format, yes. At least 2 of these are indestructible though. But while the rest are risky, they don't take up slots in the deck and immensely help with affinity. Especially the last one, since we can pay double X and sacrifice it to create X treasure tokens. This can not only help us hardcast any expensive spells, but it also helps out with affinity. Arcane Signet, Rakdos Signet, Talisman of Indulgence, and Soul Ring also help out with affinity, while also providing mana acceleration. Is it risky to run artifact-based mana acceleration instead of land-based mana acceleration? Yes, but the risk is worth the rewards given how they're being used in this deck. That being said, Nykthos Shrine to Nyx is also included as a land-based mana acceleration effect. It doesn't take up a slot on the deck and has the potential of tapping down for a ton of mana, especially with most of the enchantments in the deck, which we'll see soon. Going back to the topic at hand, Draco, Scion of Draco, and Stratodon are some more artifact creatures with built-in cost reduction effects. They have huge mana values, particularly Draco, which is the highest costed artifact and or creature in the deck. Since it has a cost that needs to be paid in our upkeep, this is 100% something we want to fling with Ayara. Now, I already know what you're asking, but Kirby, how are we going to get a worthwhile domain bonus in a 2-colored deck? Surely you're not just depending on Mycosynth Golem for them, aren't you? Fear not, viewer, the deck is running Navigator's Compass, Unstable Frontier, and Tundra Kavu to help with domain. The first 2 can be tapped down to give any land we control any basic land type, so we can very easily choose island or plains to help with domain. The Kavu can only choose one of those 2 types anyways, but it's fine because those are the lands we can't play in the deck. Having all of these in play will always give us a domain value of 5, since the deck is already running plenty of swamps and mountains. Speaking of, Orberg Tomb of Yawgmoth and Yavimaya Cradle of Growth are included to help with domain. Granted, Orberg is more for color fixing, but Yavimaya alone helps us get a domain value of 3, all without taking up a slot in the deck. Thanks to these 5 cards, we're able to feasibly run Draco, Scion of Draco, and Stratodon. Gate Colossus is an artifact creature that has a cost reduction effect dependent on how many gates we control when we cast it. Fortunately, we can run 9 gates that are in Ayara's color identity, so this has potential of being completely free. Not only that, but it also has a self-recovery effect whenever a gate enters the battlefield under our control. It can't be blocked by weenies, but it's mostly here to be flung by Ayara for potentially 0 mana. The 9 gates running the deck are Baldur's Gate, Basilisk Gate, Black Dragon Gate, Cliff Gate, Gateway Plaza, Gone Gate, Heap Gate, Rakdos Guild Gate, and Thran Portal. Apart from the gates that are included solely for being gates, and thus simply being part of the deck's mana base, some of these gates are actually pretty useful. Baldur's Gate has the potential of tapping down for a bunch of mana with its Cabal Coffers type ability, which is helpful at casting our expensive spells. Basilisk Gate has the potential of giving a significant pump to a beater, especially if it's one an opponent couldn't block or had trample. Sure, these 2 depend on how many gates we control, but that won't be a problem. Heap Gate can be used to create treasure tokens. It does require 1 mana plus tapping down a gate, meaning that it's depriving us of 3 mana each time to do it, but accumulating treasure tokens with mana we're not using will help us out in the long run in terms of mana acceleration or affinity. Gone Gate is one of the most important gates here since it has gates enter the battlefield untapped. This helps us out a ton since most gates enter the battlefield tapped, especially the gates that are solely for the deck's mana base. Thran Portal is the next most important gate in the deck because it also helps with domain. When it enters the battlefield, we can choose a basic land type and it will also be that type. So we can choose plains or island and we have that land type for domain. It does require 1 life to tap for mana, but that's not an issue. Due to these 9 gates, Mace's End is obviously included in the deck. Consider it land-based mana acceleration that doesn't take up a slot on the deck. Being able to fetch us a gate with each activation might seem incredibly slow, but it still helps us accelerate us along, even if it's once every other turn. This might seem like a lot of work just to include Gate Colossus, but we're doing two things at once. We have the potential of ramping for these gates while also getting a free way of dealing 8 damage to an opponent. Going back to creatures with Flinging with Ayara, the deck's also running things like Duplicant, Meteor Golem, and Spine of Ishsa. These don't have any built-in ways to reduce their cost though, so hopefully we're able to cheat them in more often than not. However, these are included because they're interaction that's high costed, which gives Ayara things to fling. Keep in mind that she can also sacrifice artifacts, so Spine of Ishsa is incredibly busted here. Get rid of a permanent, sacrifice it to Ayara to deal 7 damage to an opponent, gaining us 7 life, and then it goes to our hand since it got sacrificed. Absolute madness. Keep in mind that Duplicant doesn't become a copy of the creature it's exiling, so we can exile a creature, then sacrifice it to deal 6 damage to an opponent. Then, if we reanimate those permanents, we can continue doing so. This can go from interaction to backbreaking loops. This can be as evil as you want it to be, but if you're playing with Ayara, be as evil as you can be. The deck is still running generic interaction though, like Invasion of Fiora, All is Dust, Eyeblight's Ending, Chaos Warp, and Tibalt's Trickery, so don't worry. Nobody ever expects Tibalt's Trickery, but it's amazing at countering anything that might be able to exile our graveyard. Unfortunately, it doesn't stop Boyukabog, but anything else is still good. Chaos Warp is a quintessential universal removal for red decks, so its inclusion here is pretty self-explanatory. As for the other choices, All is Dust is busted in this deck since most of its permanents are colorless. We do lose everything else, but sometimes the board needs wiping. Invasion of Fiora gives us the option of destroying all legendary creatures or non-legendary creatures, so it's going to depend on the situation. However, since Ayara can also hit battles, we can defeat this battle to get Marquesa Resolute Monarch. A 3/6 with Vengeance and Death Touch is pretty good, but when she attacks, we can remove all counters from any permanent. So we can kill off Planeswalkers, get rid of +1/+1 counters from a huge creature, or also any counters from any of our other battles. If that weren't enough, we also draw a card and gain 1 life if we weren't dealt combat damage since our last turn. So she's a conditional Phyrexian Arena. And if we needed anything to fling with Ayara, as a double-faced card, her mana value is still 6. Eyeblight's Ending might seem like an inefficient choice in the deck, but there's better removal. However, it's one of the best removal spells in black that's also tribal. Notice that All is Dust is also tribal. They're included in order for there to be at least one more tribal card in the deck. Recall that this helps Emrakul cost as low as possible if we needed to hardcaster, so having at least 2 tribal cards in the deck is okay. Now that we saw most of the deck's missiles and how they're almost never costing what's printed in the top right corner of the card, how can we be even more efficient with them? We can still cheat them onto the battlefield if they're still too expensive to cast. This is where Arms Race, Sneak Attack, and Quicksilver Amulet come in pretty handy. Arms Race can also be used to get those expensive artifact creatures into play for just 4 mana as well as non-creature artifacts, so keep that in mind. Doing this with Spine of Ishsa can be especially harrowing for opponents since we get it into play for just 4 mana, sacrifice it at the beginning of their end step, and then get it back into our hand again. Absolutely busted. Sneak Attack does it better though, since it can get creatures onto the battlefield for just 1 red mana. Since they gain haste, we might as well attempt to swing in with them before flinging them with Ayara before they have to be sacrificed. Sneak Attack is definitely one of the best cards here. Quicksilver Amulet has the same activation cost as Arms Race, but at least we keep the creature since it doesn't have to be sacrificed at the end of our turn. Imagine paying only 4 mana to get Shadow of Mortality or Draco onto the battlefield, or just 1 red mana with Sneak Attack. The amount of damage we can deal with Ayara for so little cost is insane. Then we can reanimate them later, thanks to Hell's Caretaker and Whisperblood Liturgist. We do have to sacrifice creatures to activate them, but at least we can reanimate any huge creature in our graveyard for it. Whisper can be done at instant speed, but Hell's Caretaker is only during our upkeep, which is still pretty good. In order to make the most of all the things the deck is doing, Field of the Dead is included to sacrifice fodder to these creatures. The deck is entirely singleton, meaning that even the lands are all one-ofs. So Field of the Dead will always trigger so long as we have at least 7 lands in play. This makes Maze's End even better, since we're also getting zombie tokens for using it. The deck is also running all 7 fetch lands, which also help trigger it, but also helps get us our lands along with Flinging in the deck. These are all the lands with basic land types in the deck. Yes, the deck needs them anyways, but they're also fetchable and help with domain. In fact, this deck isn't even running Command Tower since it's not fetchable. As for getting the other lands more often than not, the deck's running Expedition Map and Hoarding Broodlord. While Maze's End is an amazing choice for Expedition Map, keep in mind that it can also be used to find Field of the Dead for fodder creation, Unstable Frontier or Yamamaya for domain assistance, etc. Hoarding Broodlord can get absolutely any card, so it can be used to get any of the deck's reanimation or cheating effects too. It also has the potential of costing much less to cast since it has Convoke. So this is yet another expensive creature Ayara can fling at an opponent. And then we can reanimate it afterwards to tutor for yet another card. Liliana's Death Majesty, the Cauldron of Eternity, and Portal to Phyrexia are more reanimation effects in the deck. Liliana's +1 also creates zombie fodder, but we do mill 2 cards, which isn't that bad. Her -3, which can be done immediately, reanimates any creature in our graveyard regardless of mana value. Her ultimate is a board wipe if we needed it, but she's mostly used for the reanimation effect. The Cauldron of Eternity costs a whopping 12 mana to cast, but it also has a built-in cost reduction ability. It has the potential of costing only 2 black mana if we have at least 5 creatures in our graveyard. Then we pay 3 mana, 2 life, and tap it to reanimate any creature in our graveyard at sorcery speed. Its only downside is that it bottom decks any creature that dies, not something we want if we're looking to revolving door our creatures between the graveyard and battlefield. Fortunately, Ayara can fling the Cauldron of Eternity in an opponent's face, which is quite the flavor event. Portal of Phyrexia is another high-costed artifact, but its ETB has each opponent sacrifice 3 creatures, which is an amazing interactive effect. Then, at the beginning of our upkeep, we can animate any creature from our graveyard. Then, if we needed to, we can yeet it with Ayara at someone's face, reanimate it, and do it all over again. Fallen of the Third Path is also technically a reanimation effect, but he doesn't actually reanimate the creature. He creates an artifact creature token copy of it. This is even better because the creature is still in our graveyard. The creature gains haste and has to be sacrificed at the end of the turn, so we can try and swing in with it and then yeet it with Ayara before it goes away. As for reanimating the non-creature artifacts I keep mentioning, the deck is running Goblin Welder. It's like Hull Caretaker but for artifacts, but we can do so at instant speed. This helps us get back Portal to Phyrexia, the Cauldron of Eternity, etc. It can also be used on artifact creatures, of which the deck has plenty of. Since the deck has a couple of cards that create treasures, those are great things to sacrifice to the Welder to get back something much bigger. This card is absolutely insane here. It can also be used against opponents, so keep that in mind for those spicy pro gamer moves. Another pro gamer move is using this with Ancient Stone Idol. Recall that it creates a 6/12 artifact creature token when it dies. We can sack it to the Goblin Welder to get Ancient Stone Idol back. Same with Hell's Caretaker. So good. Faithless Looting, Cathartic Pyre, Thrill of Possibility, Tormenting Voice, Wild Guess, Invasion of Mercadia, Cathartic Reunion, and the Ready Scrap Savant are included to not only draw cards but to get reanimation targets into the graveyard. You can never go wrong with cheap loot effects in a red deck. Of note here is Invasion of Mercadia. It loots when it enters the battlefield, but upon defeating, transforms into Chiron Flameright. Not only is this yet another discard outlet, but it gives us sacrifice fodder we do as well as pumping our creatures and giving them haste, if we needed our huge creatures to get any bigger. It's also the second of 2 battles in the deck which are included because they're good, and they help cheapen Emrakul's casting cost. Also, Ayara helps defeat battles, so there's that too. The Ready is the second of 2 planeswalkers in the deck for the same reason. Emrakul needs those different card types. In any case, the Ready is amazing here since his +2 loyalty ability is a rummage effect, and his -2 loyalty ability is a Goblin Welder type effect. If that weren't enough, if he survives long enough to ultimate, his emblem is absolutely busted here. We get any artifact back to the battlefield at the end of the next end step. This is absolutely insane with Ayara or other effects such as Goblin Welder or even the Ready himself with his -2 ability. With all of this synergy is fine and dandy, we can make even further use of Ayara's ability. Unfortunately, her only downside is hitting one opponent at a time. While dealing 7 or more damage at once is something to scoff at, we want it to be more. Jumping through hoops to yeet Draco at an opponent's face isn't going to cut it. That's why the deck is running Battle Mage's Bracers and Illusionist's Bracers. Equipping Ayara with any of these will double that damage dealt and life we gain. As a bonus, the red bracers give her haste but require paying 1 generic to get the doubling effect. Having both equipped quadruples her effect, which is never not splendiferous. Lithoform Engine and Rings of Brighthearth can also double her activated ability, but each cost 2 mana to do so. As a bonus, the engine can also be used to copy triggered abilities and spells. This could be interesting if we're casting things for free. For example, casting Ancient Stone Idol for free means having 2 of them for just 4 mana. We can also copy any instant or sorcery for 3 mana. This card does a lot in this deck. Thousand Year Elixir doesn't double Ayara's ability per se, but we can untap her for just 1 generic and tapping in order to activate her again. This is quite powerful since we can activate Ayara at instant speed. As a bonus, it also lets us activate Ayara as if she didn't have Summoning Sickness. Same with Felden, Whisper, Goblin Welder, etc. As for more multiplicative effects, look no further than Angrath's Marauders, Fiendish Duo, Gratuitous Violence, Obosh the Prey Piercer, Solfim Mayhem Dominus, City on Fire, and Fiery Emancipation. The first 5 double the damage dealt, while the last 2 triple the damage dealt. If that weren't enough, Angrath's Marauders cost 7 mana to cast. While it doesn't have any built-in cost reduction, if worse came to worse, it's yet another missile for Ayara to yeet at an opponent's face. Obosh only cares about odd-costed cards we control, so keep that in mind. Fortunately, Ayara has an odd casting cost. Solfim has the bonus of becoming easily indestructible with a discard effect, which is even better for this deck. For sake of having the best game of your life, if you had all 7 of these permanents in play while you yeeted an artifact or a creature to an opponent with Ayara, she'd deal 288 times X to an opponent's face. Suffice it to say that they'd probably die to that. You still only gain just X life though, but it doesn't matter how much life you have if you win the game. This brew is just an idea of how to build around Ayara, Widow of the Realm. The moment I saw her, my mind bubbled with so many ideas. It's like all at once I knew I want to cheat in high mana value creatures, whether by reducing their cost or cheating them into play from my hand or graveyard. Ayara's only downside is hitting one opponent at a time, but you can still deal tons of damage. The deck is also quite resilient since it's potentially reanimating and recurring the best missiles for Ayara to launch across the board. If you're interested in this deck list of this spicy brew of mine, you can find a link to it down in the description. I would like to thank all my patrons for supporting me, and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the Brewers, for their patronage. I'd also like to thank anyone using my TCG Player affiliate link, that also helps out the channel. I also want to thank everyone for being so patient and understanding while I recovered from my illness. It is very much appreciated. As always, thanks for watching this episode of The Brewery on the Commander Tavern. I am the Bandit Kirby, and happy brewing.